My husband mocked me in front of our biggest investors. His casual joke ended our marriage on the spot. For years, I let him play the charismatic CEO while I ran the empire in the shadows. But as the room erupted in laughter, I only looked at our 8-year-old son, Caleb. The shame in his quiet eyes broke something inside me. Jason thought he was the king of Connecticut. He had no idea I already owned the kingdom. Before I tell you how I dismantled his life, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it? The clock was ticking. Rewind to just 3 hours before the end of my marriage. The crystal room at the Connecticut Country Club was suffocatingly warm, heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and roasted prime rib. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of our 15th wedding anniversary, but Jason had turned it into a networking event. Of course he did. He never missed a chance to perform. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of sparkling water warming in my hand. From across the room, I watched Jason holding court. He wore his tailored navy suit like a second skin, throwing his head back in laughter, clapping wealthy developers on the shoulder. He looked like the perfect American success story. He was the golden boy of local real estate, the charismatic face of our company. I was just the quiet wife in the understated black dress. But while Jason was trading golf scores and empty promises, my mind was running the numbers. $2.5 million. That was the exact deficit we were facing if the upcoming waterfront project fell through. Jason had practically guaranteed the investors a return. We did not have the capital to back up. I knew this because I was the one who balanced the ledgers. I was the one who stayed awake until 3 in the morning, moving funds, restructuring debt, and covering up his reckless financial promises. Jason did not know the difference between a gross margin and a golf handicap. He truly believed the money flowed simply because people liked his charm. I let him believe it. For years. I let him take the credit because it kept the peace in our house. It kept the environment stable for Caleb. Whenever Jason tried to explain a deal, he sounded confident, but the substance was entirely missing. When questions got too technical, he would flash his signature smile, point across the room at me, and say, "You will have to ask my wife, the numbers wizard. She keeps me out of jail." The men would chuckle. I would offer a polite, practiced smile. I had perfected that smile over a decade. It was my armor, my camouflage. Everyone saw a handsome, powerful couple. No one saw the panic I managed behind closed doors. No one saw how I built the fortress that Jason pranced around in. I was the architect, the strategist, the unseen engine. He was merely the mascot. I used to think my silence was an act of devotion. I convinced myself that by managing the crises invisibly, I was being a good partner. But watching him bask in the admiration of men he was secretly defrauding, a cold realization washed over me. The foundation of his entire life was resting entirely on my shoulders. If I simply decided to step out of the way, his world would crumble into dust. I just had not realized how close I was to taking that step. The curtain was falling. A waiter floated past with a tray of champagne. I took a glass, though I rarely drank at these events. I needed a clear head to catch the details Jason missed. Suddenly, Jason's hand was on the small of my back, guiding a group of older, distinguished men toward me. "Gentlemen, I want you to meet the real boss," Jason announced. His tone was jovial, but the grip on my back was just a fraction too tight, a silent command to play my part. "This is Laura." The men offered polite nods. One of them, a silver-haired developer from New York, smiled warmly. "Jason has been telling us how you keep the administrative side running so smoothly. Laura, behind every great man." Right. Administrative side. The words tasted like ash. I did not just file papers. I drafted the entire zoning proposal they were currently praising him for. I negotiated the interest rates that made their profit margins possible. But Jason laughed, a booming, effortless sound. Oh, she is the perfect secretary, honestly. If I left her in charge of the big decisions, we would still be living in a condo. She is terrified of risk, but she organizes my calendar like nobody's business. The men chuckled. My chest tightened. Perfect secretary. Terrified of risk. He delivered the insult so smoothly, wrapped in a compliment about my organizational skills, that no one else heard the venom. It was his signature move. He loved to diminish me in public to elevate his own stature. He needed these men to see him as the fearless visionary, and the easiest way to do that was to paint me as the timid assistant. I looked at his handsome, smiling face for a fleeting second. I wanted to open my mouth and tell these men exactly whose signature was required to clear the $2.5 million loan they were depending on. I wanted to explain that Jason was legally prohibited from making any unilateral financial moves because of his disastrous credit history. But I bit my tongue. I always bit my tongue. I thought about Caleb, sitting at a table nearby with his sketchbook, safely shielded from adult conflicts. If I embarrassed Jason here, he would make our home a living nightmare for weeks. He would slam doors, give me the silent treatment, and direct his subtle, cutting sarcasm at our son. It was never worth the fallout. So, I took the hit. I swallowed the pride that was screaming in my throat. I lowered my eyes, offered that same practiced smile, and played the role of the dutiful, quiet wife. Jason is the visionary, I said softly, the lie burning on its way out. I just keep the paperwork tidy. Jason beamed, squeezing my waist in approval. He had won another minor victory. He had successfully rewritten reality to suit his ego, turning my massive, silent sacrifices into proof of my dependence on him. He genuinely believed I was too weak to ever correct the record. He confused my patience with powerlessness. He mistook my strategic silence for submission. He had no idea how dangerous a quiet woman could be when she was finally done listening. He miscalculated my strength. The group of developers drifted toward the buffet, leaving Jason and me standing near the jazz band. Jason checked his reflection in a passing window, straightening his silk tie. "See, that wasn't so hard," he muttered under his breath, not even looking at me. "Just keep smiling. Laura. Sterling should be here any minute." Marcus Sterling was the white whale of the evening. He was the quiet billionaire whose investment firm could single-handedly save Jason's over-leveraged waterfront project. Jason had been relentlessly courting him for 6 months, desperate for a commitment. 10 minutes later, the grand doors of the crystal room opened. Sterling walked in. He did not look like a man who controlled billions. He wore a simple gray suit, no tie, and moved with a quiet, unhurried grace. Jason immediately went into overdrive. He practically sprinted across the floor, extending both hands, his voice booming over the soft music. "Marcus, so glad you could make it to our little anniversary gathering." Sterling shook Jason's hand, his expression polite, but entirely unreadable. As Jason launched into a rehearsed monologue about market trends and his grand vision for the upcoming quarter, Sterling let his eyes wander. His gaze bypassed Jason entirely and landed directly on me. He excused himself from Jason's enthusiastic grip and walked slowly toward my corner of the room. Jason scrambled to follow, looking slightly panicked. "Marcus, this is my wife, Laura," Jason said quickly, stepping between us as if to block my view. "She is the one who handles the minor details back at the office." Sterling stopped. He looked at Jason for a long, agonizing moment. Then, He stepped around my husband and extended his hand to me. "Laura," Sterling said. His voice was deep, resonant, and completely serious. "It is a privilege to finally meet the architect." The word hung in the air. Architect, not secretary, not administrative help. Jason let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. "Oh, well, she organizes the files. Marcus, let's not get carried away." Sterling did not laugh. He did not even look at Jason. His eyes remained locked on mine, sharp and intelligent. "I have read the financial restructuring proposals for the waterfront deal," Sterling said quietly, speaking only to me. "The risk mitigation strategy is brilliant. A masterclass in leverage. That level of precision does not come from a visionary. It comes from someone who understands the absolute reality of numbers." My heart gave a sudden, hard thump. He knew. I did not know how. But this quiet, powerful man had looked past the glossy brochures and the charismatic presentations. He had seen the invisible fingerprints I left on every document. He knew Jason was a fraud. Sterling offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was a knowing glance, a silent pact formed in the middle of a crowded room. In that single moment, the entire dynamic of my life shifted. For 15 years, I thought I was invisible. I thought my silent labor was buried under Jason's shadow forever. But I was seen. I had a powerful ally on the board, and Jason was completely oblivious. The game was changing. As Sterling walked away to get a drink, Jason glared at me, his jaw tight. "What the hell was that?" he hissed, keeping his voice low so the other guests would not hear. "Did you send him documents without telling me?" I shook my head, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I sent the standard portfolio. Jason, the one you approved." He scoffed, adjusting his cuffs aggressively. "Well, do not let it go to your head. He is just being polite to the wife. Remember who built this company." I watched him walk away to corner another investor, and a heavy, familiar exhaustion settled into my bones. Why did I stay? It is the question I know people would ask if they saw the reality of my marriage. How does an educated, capable woman let a mediocre man treat her like a footstool for 15 years? The truth is, the chains of a toxic marriage are rarely forged out of iron. They are woven from invisible threads of obligation, guilt, and a slow, methodical erosion of your reality. It did not start with him calling me a secretary. It started with small, easily forgivable things. A dismissive joke about my clothing choices. A heavy sigh when I voiced an opinion. Whenever I objected, he would twist the narrative, making me feel like I was the one being overly sensitive, too emotional, or ungrateful. "I am just trying to help you, Laura," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. Over the years, that constant dripping wore away the stone of my self-esteem. You begin to accept the bizarre logic of your captor. I convinced myself that his public arrogance was just a quirky personality trait. I told myself that managing his chaotic finances was my duty as a loyal wife, but the thickest chain of all was Caleb, my beautiful, sensitive 8-year-old boy. Society tells you that a broken home is the worst thing you can inflict on a child. I believed the lie that maintaining a miserable, intact family was better than navigating the unknown of a divorce. I thought I was absorbing the shockwaves so Caleb would not have to feel them. I became a human shield. I normalized the cruelty because acknowledging it meant I would have to destroy the only life my son knew. It is called learned helplessness. You stay in the cage so long that even when the door is left wide open, you forget how to walk out. You convince yourself that the cage is the whole world. I let Jason isolate me from my old friends. I let him convince me that without his charm, My intelligence was utterly useless in the real world. I swallowed my pride daily to keep the peace. I traded my identity for the illusion of a happy family. I thought my endurance was a virtue. I did not realize it was a slow, quiet suicide. But looking at Jason across the room, desperately performing for men who secretly saw right through him, the invisible chains finally snapped. I was not helpless. I was just waiting. My clarity that evening did not come out of nowhere. It came from a memory I had buried deep in the back of my mind. A memory of the only man who ever truly protected me. My father, Arthur. Arthur was a man of few words and immense integrity. He built our real estate business from a single rundown storefront into a respectable portfolio. He never cared about country club memberships or bespoke suits. He cared about concrete, steel, and airtight contracts. When Jason and I first started dating, my father was polite, but his eyes always held a quiet reservation. He saw past Jason's dazzling smile long before I ever did. 6 years ago, when the cancer began to rapidly consume my father's lungs, he called me into his hospital room. His voice was frail, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He did not ask to see Jason. He only wanted me. Laura, he had wheezed, gripping my hand with surprising strength. I am not leaving my life's work to a man who treats a balance sheet like a casino. I am leaving it to the architect. 2 weeks before he passed, he forced himself out of his hospital bed. He had his private driver take just the two of us to the grand, marble-floored lobby of the First National Bank downtown. I remember the cold air of the vault, the heavy scent of old paper and polished brass. My father sat at a private mahogany table, breathing heavily from a portable oxygen tank. He pushed a thick stack of legal documents toward me. "Sign these," he commanded gently. "Do not tell Jason. Do not tell anyone. This is your shield." I had signed them through tears, barely reading the dense legal jargon. I trusted him implicitly. He handed me a small, heavy brass key. "There is a safe deposit box here," he told me, closing my fingers around the cold metal. "Number 412. Inside is the irrevocable trust, the original deeds, and the operating licenses. Jason will think he is the CEO. Let him play the boss. But legally, on paper, he will be nothing more than an employee. You hold the leash." I had kept that key hidden in a hollowed-out book on my bedside table for 6 years. I never used it. I never wanted to believe my marriage would deteriorate to the point where I would need to deploy my father's ultimate weapon. I wanted to trust Jason. I wanted to build a partnership based on love, not legal leverage. So, I let the document sit in the dark. I let Jason take the title of CEO. I let him believe he had conquered Arthur's empire. But standing in the ballroom, watching my husband belittle my existence while begging for validation from strangers, I felt the phantom weight of that brass key against my palm. My father had known. He had foreseen this exact moment. He loved me enough to build a fortress around me that Jason could never breach. The weapon was ready. The breaking point did not actually happen at the country club. It happened 3 months earlier, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in our kitchen. Caleb had come home from school practically vibrating with excitement. He was clutching a large sheet of thick watercolor paper. He had painted a landscape, a beautiful, detailed rendering of a house by the ocean. The colors were vibrant, blending seamlessly into one another with a skill that was extraordinary for an 8-year-old. I was telling him how proud I was when Jason walked through the door. He had just returned from a golf trip to Florida, his skin tanned, his golf bag slung over his shoulder. Caleb ran up to him, holding the painting high. "Look, Dad, I got a gold star in art class today." Jason did not even set his bag down. He barely glanced at the paper. More flowers and houses. Caleb. Jason sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if he were dealing with a massive inconvenience. You are 8 years old. Boys your age are playing Little League, learning how to throw a baseball, not playing with wet paint. Jason tossed his heavy, damp rain jacket onto the granite counter. It landed directly on top of Caleb's painting, smearing the wet watercolors and tearing the edge of the paper. Jason did not apologize. He simply walked to the fridge to get a beer. I watched Caleb. My son did not cry out loud. He did not throw a tantrum. He just folded into himself, his small shoulders slumping as he quietly pulled the ruined painting out from under the jacket. He looked so small, so utterly defeated. The sheer cruelty of casually destroying a child's spirit without a second thought made my blood turn to ice. I did not yell at Jason. Screaming would only make Caleb more anxious. I simply helped my son clean up the mess and tucked him into bed. The next morning, while Jason was sleeping off his drinks, I drove straight to downtown Hartford. I parked in front of a sleek glass building and took the elevator to the top floor. I walked into the law offices of Marlene Vance. Marlene was in her late 60s, a woman of steel and sharp-tailored suits. She was my father's oldest friend and the fiercest family attorney in Connecticut. I sat in her leather chair and, for the first time in a decade, I told the truth. I told her about the subtle insults, the financial recklessness, the slow, methodical erosion of my reality. Marlene listened in absolute silence. When I finished, she folded her hands on her mahogany desk. "You are not crazy, Laura," Marlene said, her voice steady and grounding. "You are being methodically erased by a narcissist. But Arthur knew this day would come. He prepared for it." Hearing those words was like taking my first full breath of air in 15 years. I was not losing my mind. I was just married to a monster. The shield was finally raised. Snap back to the present. The crystal room at the country club was warm, the air thick with the smell of roasted meats, expensive wine, and corporate greed. The anniversary dinner was winding down, and the jazz band had transitioned to a slow, lazy tempo. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table designated for the few children in attendance, stood up. He held a small sketchbook against his chest and navigated through the maze of tables toward us. He wanted to show me a charcoal sketch he had made of the towering swan ice sculpture in the center of the room. Before he could reach me, Jason intercepted him. Jason had consumed at least 4 martinis by this point. His face was flushed, and his voice was louder than necessary. He snatched the sketchbook out of Caleb's small hands. "What do we have here?" Jason slurred slightly, holding the book up like a trophy. He turned to Marcus Sterling and the other wealthy developers at our table. "Look at this. Gentlemen, my son, the sensitive, brooding artist." The men at the table exchanged polite, uncomfortable glances, but Jason plowed forward, oblivious to the changing atmosphere. "I keep trying to get him out on the fairway," Jason boomed, clapping a heavy hand on Caleb's frail shoulder. "I bought him a custom set of junior clubs last month. But no, he prefers to sit in the corner and play with crayons. He is terrified of a little competition. I guess he gets his extreme caution from his mother." Jason winked at me, a cruel, mocking gesture. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if he is going to grow up to be a man at all. But hey, I guess every family needs at least one confident adult. Right. A few of the men, desperate to appease the man they thought controlled the waterfront deal, let out a booming, masculine chorus of laughter. It was a suffocating, ugly sound. I looked at Caleb. His face had turned scarlet. His lower lip trembled, and his eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, silent plea for protection. He was shrinking under the weight of his own father's public humiliation. The invisible chain that had bound me for 15 years did not just snap in that moment. It shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. I looked at Jason. I really looked at him. I stripped away the tailored suit, the white-toothed smile, and the charming facade. I saw nothing but a weak, hollow, pathetic man who needed to feed off the pain of an 8-year-old boy to inflate his own fragile ego. He was not a king. He was a parasite. And I had been his willing host for far too long. The calculations in my head stopped. The desire to keep the peace evaporated. The laughter had to stop. The cruel laughter of the investors was still echoing in the high ceilings of the crystal room. I did not flush with anger. I did not shed a single tear. Panic and rage are emotions you show to your equals. Jason was no longer my equal. I simply stood up from my chair. The movement was so smooth, so deliberate, that the men at the table immediately stopped laughing. I reached out and calmly took the sketchbook from Jason's loose grip. I folded it carefully, knelt down to Caleb's eye level, and handed it back to him. "Your drawing is beautiful, sweetie," I whispered. "Go wait for me by the coat check." Caleb nodded quickly and hurried away, safely out of the blast radius. I stood back up. I picked up my heavy, silver salad fork. I tapped it once, sharply, against the edge of my crystal water glass. Clink. It was a small, sharp sound, but it cut through the remaining ambient noise of our table like a scalpel. Complete silence fell over our group. Marcus Sterling leaned back in his chair, his intelligent eyes fixed intensely on me. Jason wore a confused, patronizing smile. He tilted his head, playing the role of the concerned, benevolent husband. "Everything okay, honey?" Jason asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Did you need to make an announcement?" I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I looked him dead in the eyes, bypassing his ego and staring straight into the hollow core of his soul. I delivered 5 calm, measured words. "I'm done being your joke." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that occurs right before a building collapses. Jason's patronizing smile froze on his face. He blinked rapidly, waiting for me to laugh, waiting for me to add a self-deprecating comment to soften the blow. I did not. I held his gaze, letting the cold reality of my statement freeze the blood in his veins. The investors stared at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their leftover prime rib. Nobody moved. I picked up my small black clutch from the table. I smoothed the skirt of my understated dress, turned my back on the man I had spent 15 years protecting, and walked out of the ballroom. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pacing of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. I collected Caleb from the coat check, handed the valet my ticket, and waited for my car. 3 minutes later, Jason burst through the front doors, his face red with panic and fury. He got into the passenger seat just as I pulled away. The drive home was a breathless, suffocating silence. Jason gripped the door handle, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. He was furious, but beneath the fury, I could smell his sudden, primal fear. The war had officially begun. The next morning, the atmosphere in our Connecticut home was as brittle as thin ice. Jason woke up with a massive headache and a deeply bruised ego. He came down to the kitchen, dressed in his expensive silk robe, expecting a confrontation. He expected me to be crying at the kitchen island. He expected me to offer a tearful apology, explaining that the stress of the waterfront project had simply overwhelmed my delicate feminine nerves. Instead, I was quietly packing Caleb's lunchbox. I placed a turkey sandwich and a juice box into the insulated bag, my movements rhythmic and completely normal. When I handed Jason his black coffee in absolute silence, his jaw tightened. The fact that I was not hysterical infuriated him more than any argument could. He needed my emotional chaos to validate his superiority. My calm demeanor left him with nothing to push against. "You deeply embarrassed me last night, Laura," he finally said, his voice cold and sharp as he leaned against the marble counter. "You made me look like an unstable fool in front of Marcus Sterling. Do you have any idea how much capital was sitting at that table?" I did not look up from the lunchbox. I zipped it closed and wiped down the counter. "I am fully aware of the capital, Jason," I replied evenly. He sneered, setting his coffee mug down with a hard thud. He resorted to his favorite, most predictable tactic: financial control. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and made a deliberate, theatrical show of opening his banking application. "I am freezing your platinum card," Jason announced. His eyes locked on me to gauge my reaction. "I am cutting your access to the joint checking account until you learn how to behave like a supportive, respectful wife in public. You can ask me directly for any household expenses. Maybe a strict budget will remind you who pays for this lifestyle." He genuinely thought he was cutting off my oxygen. He thought he was locking me out of my own life, reducing me to a dependent child begging for an allowance. He believed that within 48 hours, I would be crawling back, apologizing just so I could buy groceries or a new pair of shoes. I did not gasp. I did not beg him to reconsider. I simply picked up my sponge, rinsed it under the stainless steel faucet, and offered him a faint, almost pitying smile. "Do whatever you feel is necessary, Jason," I said softly. I watched him march out of the kitchen, his posture rigid with the false victory he thought he had just claimed. I almost laughed out loud. He had no idea that the joint account he just locked me out of was merely the decoy account I let him manage. He locked the wrong door. It was midnight. The house was perfectly still, enveloped in the quiet darkness of the suburbs. Jason was asleep in the master bedroom, snoring softly, entirely convinced that his petty financial embargo had successfully disciplined his rebellious wife. I sat in my home office on the first floor. The only illumination in the room came from the dual monitors glowing on my desk. I locked the heavy oak door, poured myself a glass of cold water, and sat down at the keyboard. I bypassed the standard accounting software that Jason occasionally monitored to feel important. Instead, I accessed the encrypted corporate server. Jason genuinely believed he controlled our finances because his signature was printed at the bottom of the company letterhead. He did not understand the intricate anatomy of the beast I had built. He did not know how to trace a shell corporation, and he certainly did not know how to read a localized tax deferment schedule. I pulled up the core vendor contracts, the municipal zoning permits, and the primary lines of commercial credit. I began compiling a meticulous, devastating digital audit. I went through the records line by line, month by month. I documented every unauthorized wire transfer Jason had made to his personal offshore accounts. I flagged every lavish weekend getaway to Miami and Vegas that he had fraudulently expensed as corporate scouting trips. I cross-referenced his personal spending sprees with the strict capital requirements mandated by the waterfront project investors. The numbers painted a horrifying picture. Jason was bleeding our cash reserves dry to fund his playboy lifestyle. He was moving money from one project to cover the deficits of another, creating a massive, unstable financial house of cards. If the market shifted even slightly, the entire company would face federal bankruptcy, and the investors would lose millions. I was not doing this out of spite. I was acting like a forensic accountant performing a clinical autopsy on a dying patient. I connected an encrypted external hard drive to my computer. I highlighted the 70 gigabytes of irrefutable, deeply incriminating financial proof. I dragged the folders over to the drive. I watched the progress bar slowly fill the screen with a steady blue light. I felt no sorrow for the man sleeping upstairs. I only felt a cold, relentless clarity. Jason thought he was punishing me by freezing a credit card with a $20,000 limit. He did not realize I was currently downloading the exact coordinates to drop a nuclear bomb on his entire existence. The progress bar hit 100%. The screen flashed a small green checkmark. Transfer complete. The numbers never tell lies. I sat in the glow of the dual monitors until 3 in the morning, dissecting 15 years of my husband's deceit. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, clinical efficiency. I was no longer a wife looking at her husband's bank statements. I was an auditor examining a hostile corporate takeover. I pulled up the records for Jason's private consulting firm, a shell company he had set up 3 years ago under the guise of exploring secondary markets. He told me it was a necessary tax vehicle. The reality was far more pathetic. I exported the transaction logs into a master spreadsheet. I watched the columns populate with undeniable proof of his arrogance. There was a wire transfer of $65,000 for a luxury sports car lease, registered to an address in downtown Boston. There were recurring charges of $12,000 for weekend retreats at boutique hotels in Miami. Whenever he claimed to be attending grueling real estate seminars, he was actually spending our capital on private cabanas and expensive dinners. I did not cry over the obvious implications of the hotel charges. Tears require a level of emotional attachment that I had completely exhausted. Instead, I focused on the math. Jason was using corporate funds to finance a secret life. He was treating the company's operating budget as his personal slush fund. To cover his tracks, he had been illegally transferring money from our clients' escrow accounts to inflate our quarterly earnings reports. It was a classic desperate shell game. I cross-referenced the offshore transactions with the strict capital requirements mandated by the upcoming waterfront project. The numbers were deeply alarming. If Marcus Sterling and the other investors realized that our liquid assets were artificially inflated by illegal transfers, the fallout would be catastrophic. The company would face immediate federal investigations. Jason would go to prison, and all the assets attached to his name would be seized. I saved every receipt, every fraudulent invoice, and every encrypted email into a secure folder. I printed hard copies of the most devastating documents, creating a physical paper trail that no hacker could erase. I organized them chronologically, tabbing the pages with color-coded sticky notes. Jason believed that because he spoke loudly in boardrooms, he controlled the narrative. But power does not reside in a loud voice. Power resides in the meticulous documentation of the truth. I slipped the thick stack of papers into a leather briefcase. The evidence was undeniable. The next afternoon, while Jason was supposedly playing 18 holes with a local politician, I drove back to downtown Hartford. I carried the heavy leather briefcase into the sleek, quiet offices of Marlene Vance. The seasoned family attorney looked up from her mahogany desk as I entered. I did not offer any small talk. I simply placed the briefcase on her desk, unlatched the brass clasps, and opened it. "I found the leak," I said evenly. "It is not a small crack, Marlene. It is a massive, deliberate hemorrhage." Marlene put on her reading glasses. She spent the next 45 minutes reviewing the highlighted spreadsheets and the fraudulent invoices in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of paper. When she finally reached the bottom of the stack, she took off her glasses and looked at me. Her expression was a mixture of professional respect and deep maternal concern. "He has committed corporate fraud on a federal level, Laura," she stated quietly. "He has exposed the entire company to catastrophic liability." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. And he is currently using our home and our son as collateral to keep me quiet. He froze my credit card this morning. He thinks he is starving me out. Marlene leaned back in her chair. He is playing checkers while you are playing chess. We need to secure the perimeter before we drop the hammer. Do you have the documents Arthur left you? I am going to the bank tomorrow, I confirmed. Before I left her office, I excused myself to the restroom. I stood in front of the wide vanity mirror, staring at my own reflection. For 15 years, I had seen a tired, anxious woman looking back at me. A woman who constantly adjusted her posture to avoid taking up too much space. A woman who believed her only value was in her silent servitude. But the woman in the mirror today was entirely different. Her spine was straight. Her eyes were calm and terrifyingly clear. I washed my hands, the cold water rushing over my skin. I dried them slowly. I was no longer the frightened mother tiptoeing around an arrogant man. I was the gatekeeper. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy, gray overcast. Jason walked into the kitchen wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. 2 days had passed since the anniversary dinner. In his mind, my silence was proof that his financial embargo had broken my spirit. He truly believed I had spent the last 48 hours marinating in regret, desperate for his forgiveness. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the granite island. He did not look angry anymore. He looked patronizingly triumphant. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto the counter. It slid across the smooth stone and stopped right in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice flat, betraying zero emotion. "Your chance to fix things," Jason said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Sterling has agreed to a final review of the waterfront proposal tomorrow afternoon, but the investors want structural guarantees. They want to see consolidated leadership." I looked down at the envelope. I did not reach for it. "Define consolidated leadership." "Jason." He sighed, adopting the tone of a tired teacher explaining basic math to a slow student. "It is an equity transfer agreement. It officially signs over your silent voting shares to me. It is a standard power of attorney framework for the new subsidiary. It proves to the board that we are a united front, and that I have the unilateral authority to make executive decisions without waiting for your approval." He was incredibly brazen. He was actively destroying our capital to fund his secret life, and now he wanted me to legally hand him the keys to the rest of the kingdom. He framed it as a favor to me, a way to absolve myself of the embarrassment I had allegedly caused him at the country club. "If you sign it," Jason added, his voice dropping to a softer, manipulative register, "I will call the bank and unfreeze your accounts. We can put this ugly little chapter behind us. We can go back to normal." Normal. His version of normal meant my complete submission. It meant surrendering my legal rights so he could continue his fraud uninterrupted. I stared at the manila envelope. Inside those pages was the final rope he intended to tie around my neck. He demanded my absolute surrender. I kept my hands resting calmly on the counter, making no move toward the envelope. "I need to read the terms before I sign over my equity," I said softly. Jason's patronizing smile vanished. His jaw clenched. He did not like resistance, especially when he thought he had already won. He took a step closer, crowding my physical space, using his height to intimidate me. "There is nothing to read." "Laura," he snapped, the charming facade cracking. "It is boilerplate legal language. You are holding up a $2.5 million deal because your ego is bruised. You need to sign it today." When physical intimidation failed to make me flinch, Jason pivoted to his most effective weapon. He looked past me, his eyes drifting toward the hallway leading to the stairs. Caleb was up there, getting dressed for school. Listen to me carefully, Jason said, his voice a low, threatening hiss. If you do not sign this, the investors walk. If the investors walk, the company takes a massive hit. That means the lifestyle you enjoy disappears. That means Caleb's private school tuition disappears. Do you want to be the reason your son has to leave his friends? Do you want to be the mother who destroyed his future just because you were feeling stubborn? It was a masterclass in psychological abuse. He was weaponizing my maternal instinct, threatening the safety of our child to extort a legal signature. A year ago, that threat would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have signed a confession to a murder if it meant keeping Caleb safe. But today, the threat just highlighted his pathetic desperation. I did not yell. I did not tell him that I already knew about his offshore accounts or the money he spent in Miami. I maintain my perfectly neutral, slightly submissive expression. If you were sitting at that kitchen island, holding a pen while your husband used your child's future as a weapon, what would you do? Would you argue? Or would you play the long game? Let me know in the comments. I picked up the manila envelope, weighing it in my hands. I looked Jason in the eyes, ensuring my voice sounded appropriately hesitant. I understand what is at stake, I murmured quietly. Let me review the clauses with a clear head. I will have it signed and ready for you before the board meeting tomorrow. Jason relaxed, his arrogant smirk returning. He thought he had successfully bullied me back into submission. I asked for 24 hours. As soon as Jason left for his office, I grabbed my coat and drove straight to the First National Bank downtown. I walked across the cold marble floor and presented my identification to the vault manager. We descended into the quiet, heavily guarded basement. I produced the heavy brass key my father had given me 6 years ago. With a solid click, safe deposit box number 412 slid open. Inside rested a pristine, leather-bound portfolio. I took it to a private viewing room and opened the thick pages. The document was titled, "The Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust." In the United States, an irrevocable trust is a formidable legal instrument. It is exactly what it sounds like. Once the trust is established and signed, it cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit permission of the named beneficiary, by placing his company, the primary real estate deeds, and the core operating licenses into this specific legal structure. My father had effectively removed those assets from his personal estate. He transferred ownership entirely to the trust itself, designating me as the sole, unchallengeable beneficiary. The beauty of the irrevocable trust lies in its absolute protection. Legally, the assets inside it did not belong to my marriage. They were entirely shielded from any claims made by a spouse in the event of a divorce. Jason could hire the most aggressive, expensive lawyers in Connecticut, but they would hit a titanium wall. Jason's name was completely absent from these foundational documents. His title as Chief Executive Officer was nothing more than a vanity plate, a temporary role permitted solely at the discretion of the trust. I traced my fingers over Arthur's strong, familiar signature at the bottom of the page. He had known Jason was a charismatic parasite. He had engineered a foolproof legal process to ensure that no matter how much Jason manipulated me, he could never legally steal the empire. Jason thought he was hours away from forcing me to sign over my equity. He had no idea that the equity was never his to begin with. I made certified copies of the trust documents. I placed the originals safely back into the steel box. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The anxiety that had plagued my chest for 15 years dissolved, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of the law. I walked out of the bank and into the crisp autumn air, armed with the ultimate truth. Jason owned absolutely nothing. I drove back from the bank with the certified copies of the irrevocable trust resting safely in the passenger seat. The midday sun broke through the heavy Connecticut clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the highway. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Jason. I let it ring 3 times, allowing him to feel the slight anxiety of being ignored. Before I finally pressed the answer button, his voice came through the speaker, tight with impatience. He wanted to know if I had signed the equity transfer yet. He reminded me, again, that the fate of Caleb's private school tuition rested entirely on my cooperation. I kept my voice soft, injecting just enough hesitation to make him believe I was still operating out of fear. I read through the documents. Jason, I said smoothly, staring at the road ahead. I understand why you need this for the investors. I understand that the waterfront project needs to show a united, consolidated leadership. I could practically hear the tension leaving his shoulders. He exhaled a long, heavy sigh of relief. He thought he had successfully bullied me back into my designated corner. Good, Jason replied, his tone instantly shifting back to the patronizing, benevolent husband. I knew you would see reason, Laura. I will have my assistant send a courier to the house to pick up the signed papers. No, I countered gently. If we are going to do this, we should do it correctly. You said the investors want to see a united front. So, let's show them. Schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Right before your final review with Sterling, I will come to the office. I will sign the equity transfer formally in front of the board and the primary investors. It will prove to Marcus Sterling that I fully support your vision and trust your leadership. There was a brief pause on the line. I knew exactly what was running through his mind. His ego was rapidly expanding. To Jason, this was not just a surrender. It was a public coronation. He would get the legal power he desperately needed, and he would get to display my submission in front of the most powerful men in the city. It was the ultimate validation of his superiority. That is actually a brilliant idea. Laura, Jason said, his voice brimming with newfound excitement. It shows total confidence. I will have the executive boardroom prepped for 2 o'clock tomorrow. Wear something nice. Let's show Sterling we are a team. He ended the call. I placed the phone back in the cup holder. A cold, quiet smile touched the corners of my mouth. Jason was going to spend the next 24 hours practicing his posture, ordering expensive catering, and dreaming about the millions he was about to secure. He thought he had orchestrated a brilliant corporate maneuver. He had no idea that I had just handed him the shovel, and he was enthusiastically digging his own grave. I spent the rest of the evening preparing my briefcase, organizing the audit, and confirming the timeline with Marlene. He built his own gallows. Friday afternoon arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. I walked into the grand lobby of our corporate headquarters precisely at 1:45. The receptionist, who was used to seeing me casually drop off Jason's dry cleaning, looked surprised when I bypassed the front desk and headed straight for the executive elevators. I wore a tailored, slate gray suit, a sharp departure from the understated, soft dresses Jason usually preferred me to wear. In my right hand, I carried the heavy leather briefcase containing the forensic audit and the irrevocable trust. The glass-walled boardroom was situated on the top floor, offering a panoramic view of the Hartford skyline. When I pushed the heavy glass doors open, the room was already humming with quiet conversation. 5 of our primary investors were seated along the polished mahogany table. Marcus Sterling sat near the center, reviewing a file on his tablet. Jason was standing at the head of the table, adjusting his silk tie and smiling broadly. When Jason saw me, his smile widened into something genuinely triumphant. "Ah, there she is," he announced, gesturing toward me as if I were a prize he had just won. "Gentlemen, my wife, Laura." Before I could take a seat, the boardroom doors opened again. Marlene Vance walked in. She looked formidable, carrying her own slim briefcase, her expression entirely unreadable. Jason's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He blinked, clearly confused by the presence of a senior family law attorney at a real estate investment meeting. "Marlene," Jason said, his tone perfectly polite but layered with subtle suspicion. "I did not realize we were expecting outside counsel today." I pulled out a leather chair and sat down, resting my hands on the table. "Marlene is here as my personal advisor, Jason," I said smoothly. "Since I am signing away my voting equity today, I asked her to be present to ensure the transition is legally seamless. I wanted everything to be perfectly transparent for the board." Jason relaxed almost instantly. His arrogance blinded him to the danger. He reasoned that a woman as timid as the one he had created would naturally need a lawyer to hold her hand during a major transaction. He looked at the investors and offered a dismissive, patronizing shrug, as if to say, "Women, right, always overly cautious." The trap was fully set. The audience was seated. The false king was standing at the head of the table, completely unaware that his reign was about to end in less than 10 minutes. Before I opened my briefcase and dropped the match on his gasoline-soaked empire, tell me, have you ever experienced that perfect, terrifying calm right before you finally stand up for yourself? Let me know in the comments if this resonates with you. Jason clapped his hands together, bringing the room to attention. He smiled at Sterling, then looked down at me. "Shall we begin?" he asked. The room went completely silent. "Before we finalize the funding for the waterfront development," Jason began, his voice projecting the perfect blend of authority and warmth, "Laura and I wanted to formalize an internal restructuring. As you know, we operate as a team, but moving forward, I will be assuming full executive control of the voting shares to streamline our acquisitions." He slid the thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany. It stopped perfectly in front of me. With a flourish, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy gold fountain pen. He laid it gently on top of the envelope. "Just sign at the bottom of page 4, sweetheart," he murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with a silent, threatening weight. I looked at the gold pen. I looked at the manila envelope. Then, I slowly pushed both of them to the side of the table. I reached down, lifted my leather briefcase onto my lap, and unlatched the brass locks. The sharp click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I pulled out 6 thickly bound folders, each tabbed with bright red and yellow markers. Without saying a word, I stood up and handed one folder to Marcus Sterling, and then systematically distributed the rest to the other investors. I kept the final folder for myself. Jason frowned, his charming facade slipping into genuine confusion. "Laura, what is this? This is not the equity agreement." "No, Jason, it is not," I replied, my voice steady, carrying the cool precision of a surgeon. "It is a comprehensive forensic audit of the company's operating accounts over the last 36 months, an audit I personally conducted." I turned my attention to the men at the table. "Gentlemen, if you turn to page 12, you will see a detailed ledger of the capital reserves allocated for the waterfront project. You will notice a deficit of $2.5 million. A low murmur of alarm rippled through the investors. Sterling immediately flipped to the designated page, his eyes scanning the numbers with terrifying speed. Jason's face drained of color. He took a step forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Laura, what the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" I ignored him completely. "If you turn to page 40, I continued, my voice never rising above a calm conversational level, "you will find the exact coordinates of where that capital went. It did not go into the foundation of your waterfront properties. It went into a private shell company. It funded a $65,000 luxury car lease in Boston. It funded recurring $12,000 hotel charges in Miami. It funded a lifestyle completely disconnected from this corporate entity. Jason practically lunged for the folder in front of me, but Marlene calmly placed her hand over it, blocking him. The room felt as though the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of it. The investors were no longer looking at Jason as a charismatic leader. They were staring at the paperwork, realizing that the man standing at the head of the table had just attempted to defraud them out of millions. The numbers spoke for themselves. Panic is a fascinating thing to observe in a man who has never been held accountable for his actions. Jason's entire physical demeanor shifted. The broad, confident shoulders collapsed inward. The polished, golden boy's smile twisted into a desperate, feral grimace. His brain was misfiring, trying to find an exit strategy in a room with no doors. He let out a loud, highly unnatural laugh. It was a harsh, jagged sound that made one of the older investors physically wince. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, please," Jason stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's all just take a deep breath. My wife, Laura, has been under an immense amount of personal stress lately. We have been dealing with some severe marital issues, and unfortunately, she is having a bit of a breakdown. These numbers are completely fabricated. It is a deeply misguided cry for help." He was falling back on his oldest trick, paint the woman as hysterical to discredit her truth. He looked at the board, desperate for someone to nod, desperate for the familiar blanket of male solidarity to protect him. "You all know me," Jason pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "I have built this company from the ground up. I would never risk our mutual success. She has misread the ledgers. She does not understand how deferred tax structures work." He looked directly at Marcus Sterling, his eyes wide with a pathetic, begging intensity. "Marcus, please. You know how these things go. A disgruntled spouse gets into the accounting software, and suddenly every legitimate business expense looks like a conspiracy. Give me 10 minutes to get my CFO in here, and we will clear this up." Sterling did not look up from the audit. He slowly turned to page 42, his finger tracing a highlighted line of offshore transfers. "Your CFO is not here, Jason," Sterling said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "But the bank routing numbers on these wire transfers match the routing numbers of your personal accounts. Are you suggesting your wife hacked into the federal banking system to forge these digital timestamps?" Jason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The gaslighting was utterly useless. He could not manipulate his way out of an encrypted wire transfer. The men at the table were no longer his friends. They were wealthy, ruthless businessmen who had just realized they were sitting in a room with a thief. The warm camaraderie that Jason had spent 15 years cultivating evaporated in less than 3 minutes. They looked at him with a mixture of cold disgust and calculation, already assessing how quickly they could untangle their assets from his sinking ship. Jason looked at me. His eyes were wild, filled with a frantic, unhinged rage. He realized, finally, that I had not brought the paperwork to negotiate. I had brought the paperwork to execute him. The charm had finally expired. "This is illegal," Jason suddenly shouted, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. The sudden violence of the gesture made a few investors jump, but I remained perfectly still. "You cannot do this. Laura, I am the chief executive officer of this company. I hold the majority voting rights. You are a minor shareholder. You have absolutely no authority to present this garbage to my board without my approval." He was clinging to his title like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He truly believed that the corporate hierarchy would save him. He believed his name on the letterhead made him untouchable. I looked at Marlene. She gave me a single, slow nod. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out one final document. It was not bound in a folder. It was a simple, stark legal contract, stamped with the heavy blue seal of the state of Connecticut. I slid it across the table toward Jason. "You do not have majority voting rights." "Jason," I said, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of his shouting. "In fact, you do not own a single share of this company." Jason stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. He did not touch it. Marlene adjusted her glasses and spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of the law. "The entity you operate, Jason, does not exist as an independent corporation," Marlene explained methodically. "It is a subsidiary holding entirely contained within the Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust, a trust established 6 years ago, naming Laura as the sole, unchallengeable beneficiary." Jason's breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked from Marlene to me, his reality fracturing. "My father knew exactly what you were," I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "He built a titanium wall around his life's work. He allowed you to hold the title of CEO because it kept you occupied. But legally, you are nothing more than an at-will employee of my trust. You serve entirely at my discretion." "No," Jason whispered, stumbling backward a step. "That's a lie. I built this. My name is on the building. Your name is on the lease." I corrected him coldly. "A lease the trust pays for. You have no equity. You have no leverage. And as of this exact moment, you no longer have a job." I stood up, resting my palms flat on the table, asserting my absolute authority over the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "For gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, and a fundamental breach of fiduciary duty, your employment is terminated, effective immediately." He was completely erased. Jason looked around the boardroom, desperate for a lifeline. He looked at the investors, men he had shared expensive scotch and private jokes with just hours ago. But the men were already packing up their tablets and closing their briefcases. Marcus Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not even glance in Jason's direction. Sterling looked at me, offering a respectful, brief nod, acknowledging the shift in power, before walking out the heavy glass doors. The others followed suit, abandoning Jason without a single word of sympathy. Suddenly, it was just Jason, Marlene, and me in the massive, echoing room. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crashed down on him. The arrogance bled out of his posture, leaving behind a hollow, desperate shell. He took a step toward me, his hands shaking. "Laura, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. The booming, confident baritone was entirely gone. "You can't do this. I'll fix the accounts. I'll pay it back. Think about Caleb. You are going to destroy his family over some bad accounting." He was trying to use my son as a shield again. A surge of cold disgust washed through me. "Caleb is exactly why I am doing this," I replied, stepping out from behind my chair. "I am not going to let you systematically destroy his self-worth the way you tried to destroy mine. You are a parasite, Jason, and I am finally cutting you off." The begging vanished, instantly replaced by a venomous, unhinged fury. His face contorted, ugly and red. "You ungrateful bitch!" he roared, lunging forward. He never reached me. Before he could close the distance, the boardroom doors swung open. 2 large, broad-shouldered security guards, whom Marlene had quietly summoned 10 minutes prior, stepped into the room. "Mr. Vance," the lead guard said firmly, stepping directly into Jason's path. "It is time to leave the premises. Now." Jason froze. He looked at the guards, then back at me. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his ruined bespoke suit. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream and smash the glass table. But he knew, in his cowardly heart, that creating a physical altercation would only result in police sirens and handcuffs. He was outmatched, outplayed, and entirely out of options. With shaking hands, he reached down and picked up his empty briefcase. He did not say another word. He turned and walked out of the room, flanked by the 2 guards. I watched him march down the long glass hallway, shrinking with every step, until the elevator doors closed and swallowed him whole. I stood in the quiet boardroom, listening to the soft hum of the city traffic below. My heart was not racing. My hands were not shaking. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The 15-year storm had finally broken. The silence was truly beautiful. Jason did not disappear quietly into the night. Arrogant men rarely accept defeat without throwing a final, desperate tantrum. Tuesday morning, exactly 4 days after I expelled him from the boardroom, a courier arrived at my front door. He handed me a thick stack of legal documents printed on the heavy, textured paper favored by aggressive litigation firms. Jason had hired a notoriously ruthless attorney from Greenwich, a man famous for burying spouses in endless, expensive legal paperwork. I took my coffee to the kitchen island and opened the envelope. The demands were entirely predictable, yet staggering in their audacity. Jason had filed an emergency injunction. He was petitioning the court to immediately freeze all corporate and personal assets. More disturbingly, he was filing for full, sole custody of Caleb. In his sworn affidavit, Jason claimed that I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. He stated that my actions in the boardroom were the result of a paranoid delusion, rendering me an unfit mother and a danger to our son's emotional well-being. He was trying to use the legal system to enforce the gaslighting he had practiced in our marriage. He thought that by threatening to take my child, I would panic, drop the embezzlement charges, and negotiate a highly lucrative settlement to make him go away. I did not panic. My heart rate did not even elevate. When you have spent 15 years managing a volatile man's manufactured crises, a fabricated legal threat is just another piece of administrative paperwork. I did not call Jason to scream at him. I did not cry over the vicious lies printed in his affidavit. I simply picked up my phone and called Marlene. I received the injunction. I told her, my voice perfectly level. He is challenging the trust and demanding full custody based on my alleged mental instability. Marlene let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He is playing his last card, Laura, and it is a bluff. Send me a scanned copy of his filing. Within 30 minutes, Marlene drafted our response. It was not a defensive plea. It was a legal guillotine. She sent Jason's attorney a certified copy of the Arthur Vance Irrevocable Trust, highlighting the specific clause that granted me absolute, unchallengeable authority over the holding company. Attached to the trust was a secondary file. It was the complete 70-gigabyte forensic audit of Jason's corporate embezzlement, complete with the offshore routing numbers and the fraudulent hotel receipts from Miami. Marlene included a single, devastatingly polite cover letter. She informed Jason's attorney that if the frivolous custody petition was not fully withdrawn within 2 hours, we would bypass the civil courts entirely. We would hand the audit directly to the federal prosecutors at the United States Department of Justice, and Jason would face immediate criminal indictment for wire fraud and corporate theft. We did not have to wait 2 hours. 45 minutes later, Marlene called me back. Her voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a flawless victory. Jason's aggressive bulldog attorney had reviewed the audit, realized his client had lied to him, and instantly recognized the federal exposure. The injunction was dropped. The custody petition was formally withdrawn. Jason's final, desperate counterattack shattered against the titanium wall my father had built. The paper tiger burned. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside my home was completely unrecognizable. For 15 years, the air in our house had been thick with an invisible tension. Even when Jason was not actively speaking, his presence demanded constant emotional management. I had spent a decade and a half walking on eggshells, monitoring his moods, and adjusting my behavior to prevent a sudden outburst of condescension. When that oppressive weight was finally removed, the sheer lightness of the house felt almost disorienting. It was a Saturday morning. The autumn sun was streaming through the large bay windows of our kitchen, casting warm, golden light across the hardwood floors. I was standing at the espresso machine, breathing in the rich, dark scent of roasted coffee beans. There was no dread gnawing in my stomach. There was no anxiety about what mood would walk down the stairs. There was only the gentle, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the soft sound of classical piano playing from the living room speaker. I took my mug and walked toward the dining area. Caleb was sitting at the large oak table. He was not huddled in the corner, trying to make himself small. He was sprawled out, occupying half the table with a massive canvas. He had his watercolors spread out around him, his fingers stained with bright streaks of cerulean blue and cadmium yellow. He was painting a vibrant, chaotic picture of a dragon flying over a city. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. For a brief, heartbreaking second, his shoulders tensed, a residual reflex from years of his father's sudden, mocking critiques. But when he saw it was just me, his posture instantly melted. A brilliant, unrestrained smile broke across his face. "Look, Mom," Caleb said, his voice ringing clear and confident in the quiet house. "I figured out how to make the fire look like it is actually glowing. You just have to mix a tiny bit of orange into the red while it is still wet." "It is incredible, sweetheart," I told him, placing a gentle kiss on the top of his head. "The colors are absolutely beautiful. You take up all the space you need." I watched him return to his painting, completely absorbed in his art, entirely free from the fear of being judged for not holding a baseball bat. The transformation in my son was the most profound reward of this entire ordeal. The nervous, stuttering boy was fading away, replaced by a child who felt safe in his own home. I sat across from him, sipping my coffee, letting the morning sun warm my face. I had lost a husband, but I had gained an entirely new universe. I was no longer the silent architect hiding in the shadows of an arrogant man's ego. I was a mother watching her son thrive. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that was painfully, beautifully clear. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely for the first time in over a decade. We were finally free. The transition at the corporate office was swift and clinical, the Monday following Jason's expulsion. I ordered the maintenance staff to remove the heavy brass letters spelling his name from the executive suite. I did not replace it with my married name. I ordered a new plaque forged in simple, elegant steel Vance Holdings. The company officially returned to the name my father had given it, effectively erasing Jason's 15-year masquerade from our corporate history. There was a brief period of uncertainty among the staff, a nervous anticipation of chaos. Jason had always projected the illusion that his charisma was the only thing keeping the lights on, but within 2 weeks, the panic subsided, replaced by a startling, highly efficient productivity. Without Jason artificially inflating the budgets or siphoning funds to cover his luxury hotel bills, our profit margins stabilized almost instantly. The ledgers balanced. The missing capital reserves began to replenish. Marcus Sterling became a frequent presence in our boardroom. He did not treat me like a timid secretary filling in for an absent executive. He treated me as an equal, a peer who understood the brutal mathematics of commercial real estate. With the fraudulent drain removed, we officially closed the $2.5 million waterfront acquisition. It was the largest single deal the company had ever secured. I signed the final contracts with the same gold fountain pen Jason had tried to force upon me just weeks earlier. But my most important executive decision had nothing to do with real estate. I took the first quarter's newly stabilized profits and established a philanthropic branch of the company. I drafted the founding documents for the Caleb Vance Arts Foundation. The program was designed to provide fully funded studio spaces, professional mentorship, and comprehensive art supplies to sensitive, creative children in the public school system who did not fit the traditional, aggressive molds of success. I wanted to ensure that boys and girls who found their voice through a paintbrush rather than a scoreboard had a safe, protected environment to grow. When I showed the foundation's charter to Caleb, explaining that it was named after him, his eyes widened with quiet awe. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his gentle nature was not a weakness to be mocked. It was a strength worth celebrating and protecting. I stood in my corner office, looking out over the Hartford skyline. The city looked different from this vantage point. It did not look like a kingdom ruled by loud, arrogant men. It looked like a grid of intersecting numbers, a massive puzzle waiting to be solved. For 15 years, I had built the foundation while someone else took the applause. Now, the applause was silent, and the foundation was entirely mine. The architect stepped forward. 12 months passed. The anniversary of the dinner at the country club came and went without a single moment of grief. Our lives had settled into a steady, prosperous rhythm. The divorce proceedings had been remarkably fast. Faced with the overwhelming threat of federal fraud charges, Jason had signed every document Marlene placed in front of him. He surrendered all claims to the trust, agreed to a heavily restricted visitation schedule, and quietly moved out of our suburban neighborhood. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon in late October. I sat on a wooden bench at the local public park, a steaming cup of tea resting in my hands. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of crimson and gold. I was waiting for Jason. According to the court mandate, he was allowed exactly 4 hours of supervised visitation with Caleb twice a month. At precisely 2 o'clock, a mid-sized, heavily used sedan pulled into the parking lot. It was a stark contrast to the $90,000 leased luxury vehicle he used to drive. Jason stepped out. The last year had not been kind to him. The golden boy aura was entirely extinguished. He was wearing an off-the-rack gray suit that did not quite fit his shoulders. He had found a mid-level sales position at a minor regional logistics firm, a job that required him to actually work for his salary rather than coast on his charm. The stress of maintaining a middle-class reality without my financial safety net had aged him 5 years in 12 months. He walked over to the bench. He offered a tight, uncomfortable smile to Caleb, handing him a brightly wrapped, generic toy from a big-box store. Caleb took it politely, murmuring a quiet thank you, but he stayed close to my side. The natural, easy bond a father should have with his son had been permanently fractured by years of cruel jokes. Before Jason could suggest they go to the playground, I stood up. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring Caleb could not hear the transaction. I looked Jason in the eyes. There was no anger left in me. There was only the cold, unyielding enforcement of a boundary. Listen to me carefully. Jason, I said, my tone flat and absolute. You are a guest in his life now, a highly restricted temporary guest. If you make one sarcastic comment about his hobbies, if you utter one joke about his sensitivity, or if you ever make him feel small to make yourself feel large, I will petition the court to revoke your visitation permanently, and you know I have the documentation to do it. Jason's jaw clenched. A flicker of the old arrogance sparked in his eyes, but it was quickly snuffed out by the heavy, exhausting reality of his new life. He looked at my calm, unbothered expression. He realized that the woman he used to command with a sigh no longer existed. I was the titanium wall now. He nodded in defeat. I sat back down on the wooden bench, pulling my coat tighter against the October chill. I watched Caleb walk toward the swing set, his sketchbook tucked securely under his arm. Jason followed a few paces behind, looking awkward and entirely out of his element. For 15 years, I had operated under the devastating delusion that my silent endurance was an act of profound love. I believed that by absorbing the insults, managing the crises, and projecting an image of the perfect, compliant wife, I was holding my family together. I was wrong. Silence in the face of disrespect does not build a fortress. It builds a prison. Every time Jason rolled his eyes at my career, every time he casually dismissed Caleb's passions, and every time the men in the boardroom laughed at my expense, a small fraction of my dignity was subtracted from the ledger of my life. I had allowed myself to become a negative balance. I thought I was protecting my son, but in reality, I was teaching him that the people who love you are allowed to treat you like a convenient punchline. It took a single, devastating moment in a crowded country club to finally balance the books. The realization hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. I did not need to scream, or throw a glass, or engage in a melodramatic screaming match to reclaim my power. Real power is exceptionally quiet. Real power is knowing your exact worth, securing your assets, and closing the door on anyone who refuses to meet your price. I look at my life now, and the contrast is breathtaking. The company thrives because it is run on precision, not ego. My son thrives because his home is a sanctuary, not a stage for a narcissist's performance. And I thrive because I finally understand the most critical lesson of all. Respect is not a gift that someone else generously decides to bestow upon you when you have suffered enough. It is not a reward for patience. Respect is a boundary. It is a line you draw yourself, entirely independent of anyone else's approval. It is a contract you write with your own soul, signed in undeniable, irrefutable ink made of steel. If you are listening to this, and you are quietly balancing the ledgers for a person who treats you like an accessory, hear me now. You are not trapped. You are just waiting for the right moment to open your own vault. Share this story if it resonates with you. Because somewhere out there, another architect is sitting in the shadows, waiting for permission to step into the light. The ledger was balanced.